Today I'm going to show you how to emulate a long exposure. And by long exposure, I mean a short long exposure, anywhere from a tenth of a second to 2 seconds. To emulate a long exposure, you're going to have to set up your camera a certain way. So first of all, you want to change your camera mode, shooting mode, to a burst mode, and you want it to be on the fastest possible setting. You want to bring down your shutter speed so that it's lower than the frame rate of the burst mode. So if your burst mode is 5 FPS, you want your shutter speed to be a fifth of a second or slower. And then you might need to change your aperture to get a proper exposure. And also you want your ISO probably to be on the lowest setting to be able to achieve the slower shutter speed. And that's all you have to do, and then you can fire off your shot holding down the shutter or use a shutter remote. I was hiking on a trail and there was another path that went to the side, and at the end of the path there was a nice waterfall, but I didn't have my ND filter, so I couldn't really take a long exposure. Like what I usually want for waterfalls is around 1 second. So instead of doing that, I used my continuous burst mode and shot this exposure at 1/8 of a second. So that's a good exposure I was able to get with my selected aperture and ISO. And I wanted 1 second of exposure, so if I shot it at 1/8 of a second, I would need 8 exposures to equal 1 second. And since I was using the continuous burst mode, it took it one after the other, so almost no space between the exposures. So this would actually be a pretty accurate emulation of a long exposure. I have these 8 photos open in Lightroom, and I'm going to do a real quick edit and then open them in Photoshop to do the emulating. So I'm just going to increase the exposure, the contrast, and boost up the contrast, give it more pop, reduce the highlights slightly. I'd like to increase the shadows a little bit, get more detail in there, increase the vibrance, and make it a little bit warmer. Alright, and I also want to get rid of the distortion and any chromatic aberrations. And for the vignette, I'm just going to take that back because I like it. I'm also going to increase the sharpening and increase the whites a little bit, and also reduce the blacks slightly. Alright, so I got a well polished image before and after. So now I'm going to copy the photo settings, Control-Shift-C to copy the settings, and then I'm going to select the rest of the photos and paste them with Control-Shift-V. Now I'm going to right click on the photos with them selected and then have them open as layers in Photoshop. Alright, so I have the photos open in Photoshop, and now the problem with these, I want to make sure that the plants are reasonably sharp, and it was really a lot of air blowing from the water going down the waterfall, and it caused the plants to have a little bit of blur. And if I did the long exposure effect with all these layers, it'd be really blurry. So I'm going to create a copy of all the layers and individually go through them and find the sharpest parts of this part of the plants and some of the plants over here. So I'm going to save these for the plants. I'm going to use these for the long exposure effect. So the way to create the effect is to average out the opacities of each photo. And I can do this in any advanced photo editing program that allows you to edit the opacity of the layer. So the formula to calculate what opacity you need for each layer, it's the layer opacity equals 1 divided by the number of layers below plus 1. So I have the second layer selected, and there's one layer below it, so that would be 1 plus 1, and that would be divided by 2. 1 divided by 2 is 50%. So the second layer would be 50%. The third layer would be 1 divided by 3, so 33%. Fourth layer would be 25%. The fifth layer would be 20%. Sixth layer would be 16%. The seventh layer would be 14%. And the eighth layer would be 12%. But once you get around to doing all of those, if you even have more layers, it gets a little bit, the opacity you're not really able to adjust in the decimal places. So I'm going to show you a different way to do it in Photoshop if you have more than a few layers. So I'm going to select the layers I want to combine, or I want to average. I'm going to convert it to a smart object. Once it converts to a smart object, I'm going to go to the menu, the layer menu, go to smart objects, stack mode, and I'm going to change it to mean. So mean averages out all the layers. So it basically emulates the long exposure, just like manually changing the opacity of each layer. Except this will be more accurate if you have more than a few layers. Alright, so now you can see this actually looks like a 1 second exposure. So if I go to the before, so 1/8 of a second, and after, so combining the 8 1/8 of a second exposures, and it makes it look like a 1 second exposure. So now here's the problem I'm going to fix next. You may not have it, but by doing a long exposure, these plants are being blurred. What I should have done is made a faster shutter speed so that I could get one clean exposure with the plants still. So doing like a faster shutter speed, maybe a 60th of a second. Well, I forgot to do that, so I'm just going to go through these layers and find the sharpest one for these plants. So I'm going to go through these layers and see which one looks the best. Alright, so I'm going to say this one looks pretty good. I'm also going to go to these plants over here and check if they're good. So I think this bottom layer looks pretty good for the bottom part, and this top layer, I'd say it looks decent enough. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the other layers I'm not going to use. So I want to use this layer for these plants on the right side, and I'm going to use this layer for the plants on the left side. So I can go ahead and create a black layer mask on this layer. So I'm going to hold down Alt, use the brush tool, make sure I have white on, and then I'm going to size it up and paint these plants in. I'm going to check the mask preview. Alright, that looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and go this layer and add a black layer mask for this one, and then just paint in the water. Alright, so I outlined the water edges. I'm going to hold down Alt, click on the thumbnail to check the layer mask preview, and then I'm just going to paint in the outline I filled. So there I did this layer, and now it's only showing this layer for the water. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and finish up editing the photo. So there's a few parts I want to fix. There's this part over here, I just want to clone out these distracting branches. So I'm just going to use the, I'll do a quick job on the clone stamping, or the healing brush. Of course, I would try to do a better job if I was actually editing this. I'm going to do this one too. And there's also the stick that was hanging into the waterfall over here. Alright, one last thing I'm going to do is add a curve adjustment. I'm going to increase the contrast, so I'm going to use the targeted adjustment tool. I'm going to go to a dark area of the photo and bring it down slightly to make the shadows a little bit darker. And I'm going to go to a brighter part of the image over here and bring that slightly up to add more contrast. So this added a nice contrast boost, and it really pulls the focus more towards the waterfall. And one more thing I'm going to do is add a glow effect. I'm going to create a clone stamp of all the layers visible. So Control Shift Alt and E will create a new layer. I'm going to go ahead and blur it with a Gaussian blur. 15 pixels. I'm going to do 20 pixels. Depending on the glow, how much of the effect you want. And then I'm going to bring down the opacity to around 15%. And then add a curve adjustment over this layer and create a clipping mask. So now this curve adjustment layer is only going to affect this layer. That was the wrong one, but so this curve adjustment is only going to affect this layer. I'm going to go ahead and add an S-curve to the curve adjustment, and then it basically added a glow effect. So if I zoom in here, you'll see a difference. So it bleeds out the highlights and the shadows a little bit and makes it have a dreamy effect. And one last thing, I'm going to straighten this out a little bit. Alright, there. And this looks pretty good, so I'm happy with the editing. So that's how you emulate in long exposure. Basically, you can use the continuous mode on the camera. Make sure the shutter speed is faster than the amount of pictures it's taking per second. So make sure it's faster than the FPS of the burst mode. And then shoot it. Bring it to Photoshop or your editing program of choice, and then average out the layers to create the effect. Thanks for watching. If you found this video useful, please give it a like, comment, and consider subscribing if you haven't done so already.